The sound of ripping fabric echoed through room 204 like a gunshot. Victoria Kane watched her navy dress tear from hem to knee as Ethan Blackwood's grip tightened on the material, his knuckles white with fury. Around them, 23 desks sat empty except for the 3 occupied by his accomplices. Each one recording with their phones like this was entertainment instead of assault. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria's fingers instinctively moved to the small device concealed beneath her collar, ensuring the audio was still transmitting clearly to the encrypted server 3 states away. At 26, she'd survived 2 tours analyzing terrorist communications in Afghanistan, but nothing had prepared her for the calculated cruelty of entitled teenagers who believed their father's position made them untouchable. Ethan stepped back to admire his handiwork, his designer shoes crunching on the scattered papers from Victoria's lesson plan. Behind him, Cole Manning cracked his knuckles with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences, while Derek Stone kept watch at the classroom door. They moved with the precision of predators who'd done this before. The afternoon light streaming through the windows of Millfield Academy caught the torn fabric as it fluttered, a banner of humiliation meant to break her spirit. But Victoria had learned long ago that predators always revealed their true nature when they thought their prey was helpless. Today would be no different, except this time, the predator had chosen the wrong target. Victoria had arrived at Millfield Academy 3 weeks ago with impeccable credentials and a carefully constructed background. On paper, she was a dedicated educator fresh from her master's program at UC Berkeley, eager to inspire the next generation of leaders at one of California's most prestigious private schools. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous for those who thought they could continue their reign of corruption unchecked. Her real name was Victoria Kane, but the military records listed her as Specialist Victoria Chun, a designation she'd used during her 5 years in Army intelligence. The transition back to civilian life had been jarring, trading the adrenaline of counterintelligence operations for the supposed tranquility of suburban education. She genuinely intended to become a teacher, to channel her analytical skills into something constructive and peaceful. That plan had lasted exactly 18 months until she received a call from Dr. Helen Price, a former colonel who now worked for the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General. Academic fraud wasn't just about cheating anymore. It had evolved into a sophisticated network of money laundering, tax evasion, and systematic destruction of legitimate students' futures. They needed someone who understood how criminal organizations operated, someone who could go undercover without raising suspicion. Victoria had spent 6 months learning to be ordinary, suppressing the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in hostile territory, practicing the mannerisms of an idealistic young teacher. She'd studied education theory with the same intensity she'd once applied to bomb-making techniques, crafted lesson plans with the precision she'd used for mission briefings. Every detail had to be perfect because lives depended on her ability to blend in completely. Millfield Academy had been selected for investigation after a pattern emerged in their graduates' performance. Students with mediocre high school records were somehow gaining admission to Ivy League universities, while exceptional students from competing schools found themselves mysteriously rejected. The statistical anomalies were subtle but unmistakable to anyone trained in pattern recognition. Something was systematically corrupting the admissions process, and all evidence pointed to Principal Robert Blackwood's administration as the epicenter. The first week had been devoted to observation and relationship building. Victoria had attended faculty meetings, participated in curriculum planning, and gradually integrated herself into the school's social ecosystem. She'd volunteered for extra duties, stayed late to help struggling students, and projected exactly the kind of earnest dedication that made administrators comfortable sharing sensitive information. During her second week, the pattern became clearer. Certain students received special treatment, that went far beyond normal accommodations. Grade changes appeared in the computer system without documentation. Test scores were retroactively adjusted, and disciplinary incidents simply disappeared from permanent records. All of these beneficiaries shared one common characteristic: their families were major donors to the school's endowment fund. Victoria had recognized the sophistication of the operation immediately. This wasn't a few teachers looking the other way or isolated incidents of favoritism. The corruption was systematic, organized, and lucrative enough to fund a lifestyle that Principal Blackwood's salary couldn't possibly support. His Mercedes, his wife's jewelry, their recent purchase of a vacation home in Tahoe, all of it pointed to income streams that existed far beyond his official compensation. The breakthrough came during her third week when she'd offered to help with the computer lab inventory. Access to the school's servers revealed a parallel grading system, encrypted files containing real academic records, alongside the sanitized versions sent to colleges. The financial records were even more damning, showing payments from parents disguised as charitable donations, funds that were then redirected to offshore accounts and shell companies. But evidence was only valuable if she could survive long enough to deliver it. Victoria had learned that lesson in Afghanistan when her unit had uncovered a Taliban weapons cache only to find themselves ambushed on the way back to base. Intelligence work required patience, careful planning, and the ability to appear vulnerable while maintaining tactical superiority. That's why she'd been so careful about building relationships with students who weren't part of the corruption. Emma Walsh, a sophomore whose parents worked double shifts to afford tuition, had become an unexpected ally. The girl was sharp, observant, and increasingly frustrated by the obvious favoritism she witnessed daily. During a conversation about college applications, Emma had mentioned strange inconsistencies in how grades were reported. Lisa Park, another teacher who'd been at Millfield for only 2 years, had also proven valuable. She'd approached Victoria after noticing similar irregularities and had been quietly documenting instances where her grades were changed without her knowledge. Lisa had tried to report the incidents to Principal Blackwood, only to be told that she was mistaken and that challenging the administration's decisions could impact her employment. The web of intimidation extended throughout the school. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Teachers who asked questions found their evaluations suddenly critical. Students who complained about unfair treatment discovered their recommendation letters were mysteriously delayed or lost. Coaches who refused to inflate athletic achievements for college recruiters found their programs defunded. The message was clear: conform or face consequences. Victoria had seen similar tactics used by criminal organizations overseas. Create a culture of fear, isolate potential whistleblowers, and ensure that everyone had something to lose if they spoke up. The only way to break such systems was to gather overwhelming evidence while appearing to be just another compliant participant. That's what made today's confrontation so dangerous. Ethan Blackwood and his crew hadn't approached her because they suspected her true identity. They'd targeted her because she'd committed the unforgivable sin of treating them like ordinary students, grading their work based on actual merit rather than their father's position. Her refusal to inflate Ethan's essay grade had triggered this escalation. But Victoria knew it was about more than academics. The essay in question had been a character analysis of Macbeth, and Ethan's submission read like it had been written by someone who'd never actually read Shakespeare. The analysis was superficial, the writing was plagiarized from multiple online sources, and the formatting suggested it had been cobbled together at the last minute. Victoria had given it a key menace, which was generous considering the obvious lack of effort. Ethan had initially tried charm, staying after class to explain how important his GPA was for college applications. When that failed, he'd enlisted his father's intervention, with Principal Blackwood calling Victoria into his office for a discussion about expectations and flexibility. The conversation had been a masterclass in administrative intimidation, filled with veiled threats about employment security and reminders about who ultimately controlled her future at the school. Victoria had agreed to reconsider the grade, buying herself time while she documented the coercion. She'd submitted a detailed report to her handler, including audio recordings of the principal's threats and evidence of similar grade changes throughout the system. The response had been swift: continue the investigation but avoid direct confrontation until they had enough evidence to ensure convictions. Unfortunately, Ethan wasn't content to wait for administrative pressure to resolve the situation. He'd interpreted Victoria's compliance as weakness, a mistake that had led to increasingly aggressive behavior. He'd started making comments about her appearance, suggesting that new teachers needed to learn their place in the school hierarchy. His friends had joined in, creating an atmosphere of constant low-level harassment designed to establish dominance. The breaking point came when Victoria discovered that Ethan had been sharing intimate photos of previous female teachers, images obtained through hacking their personal devices or installing hidden cameras in their classrooms. The victims had been too terrified to report the crimes, knowing that Ethan's father controlled their employment and that law enforcement in their wealthy district rarely prosecuted the children of prominent families. This wasn't just academic fraud anymore. It was sexual harassment, criminal invasion of privacy, and systematic abuse of power that had been permitted to flourish because the perpetrators believed themselves untouchable. Victoria had seen similar patterns in war zones, where those with power preyed on the vulnerable while institutions looked the other way. The dress-ripping incident was meant to be the culmination of their campaign, a public humiliation designed to force her resignation. They'd waited until after school hours when most faculty had left, ensuring there would be no adult witnesses to their assault. The phones recording the incident weren't just for their own entertainment. They were creating leverage, evidence they could use to destroy her reputation if she tried to fight back. But Victoria had spent 5 years learning to read situations like this, to identify the moment when violence became inevitable and position herself for survival. Every detail of the classroom had been cataloged: the distance to the emergency alarm, the weight of the textbooks that could serve as weapons, the sight lines that would be visible to the security cameras she'd confirmed were recording everything. Most importantly, she'd recognized that this wasn't really about her. Emma Walsh had tried to warn her, mentioning that previous teachers who'd challenged the system had suffered similar treatment. Lisa Park had shared stories about colleagues who'd been driven out through campaigns of harassment and intimidation. This was a pattern, a systematic method for eliminating threats to their criminal enterprise. The realization brought clarity. This wasn't a teaching job anymore. It was an intelligence operation in hostile territory. Every principle she'd learned about gathering evidence while maintaining cover was relevant. Every technique for surviving in enemy territory applied. The scared young teacher persona had served its purpose, but now it was time to demonstrate why Army intelligence had recruited her in the first place. As Ethan stepped back to admire the torn dress, his expression shifting from anger to satisfaction, Victoria felt the familiar calm that preceded tactical action. The room was secured, the evidence was transmitting, and her backup was in position. 3 privileged teenagers were about to learn the difference between perceived power and actual authority. The torn fabric wasn't a symbol of her humiliation. It was proof of their assault. The recorded phones weren't their insurance policy. They were documentation of federal crimes. And the 5 words she was about to speak weren't a plea for mercy. They were a declaration of war against a system that had operated in the shadows for far too long. Victoria straightened her shoulders, looked directly into Ethan's eyes, and prepared to transform from victim to prosecutor. The investigation phase was over. Now came justice. The silence that followed the tearing sound stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Victoria could feel the weight of their expectations, the hunger for her breakdown that would validate their sense of superiority. Ethan's breathing had quickened with excitement, the rush of someone who'd crossed a line and found it exhilarating rather than terrifying. Cole Manning's phone remained steady in his grip, capturing every angle of what they believed would be their triumph. Victoria had encountered this exact dynamic in interrogation scenarios during her military service. The moment when subjects believed they held absolute power, when their guard dropped completely because they assumed their victim was helpless. It was always the most dangerous moment and simultaneously the most vulnerable one for the aggressor. Derek Stone shifted his weight near the door, his role as lookout making him the most nervous of the three. Unlike his companions, he seemed to grasp that they'd moved beyond typical school mischief into territory that could have serious consequences. His eyes kept darting toward the hallway, watching for approaching footsteps that might interrupt their carefully orchestrated humiliation. The torn dress hung awkwardly around Victoria's legs, the fabric catching on the edge of her desk as she turned to face them fully. She could feel the cool air against her exposed skin, but instead of shame, she felt only the familiar clarity that came with tactical assessment. The room's layout, the positions of her assailants, the available exits, the location of potential weapons, every detail crystallized into sharp focus. Ethan took a step closer, emboldened by her apparent paralysis. His expensive cologne mixed with the scent of privilege and entitlement, a combination that had probably never failed to intimidate his previous targets. He'd grown up believing that his father's position as principal made him untouchable, that wealth and influence created an impenetrable shield around his actions. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria. She'd spent months watching him operate, documenting his systematic abuse of power while maintaining her cover as a naive young teacher. Every interaction had been carefully calculated to reinforce his perception of her as weak and controllable. Now that facade was about to shatter in spectacular fashion. Behind Ethan's confident swagger, Victoria could see the insecurity that drove his need to dominate. 3 years of analyzing terrorist psychology had taught her to recognize the patterns of those who used violence to mask their fundamental weakness. Ethan wasn't a predator by nature. He was a spoiled child playing at being dangerous because genuine authority had always been handed to him without effort. Cole Manning lowered his phone slightly, apparently concerned that Victoria's lack of reaction wasn't providing the entertainment they'd expected. His quarterback mentality demanded clear wins and losses, dramatic moments that could be celebrated or used as leverage. A target who refused to break, according to script, was problematic for someone whose worldview depended on predictable power dynamics. Victoria had spent considerable time studying Cole's background during her investigation. His athletic prowess had earned him a full scholarship to Stanford, but the academic requirements attached to that scholarship were being met through systematic grade manipulation. His English grades alone had been artificially inflated by nearly 2 full letter grades, transforming a C student into someone who appeared capable of handling university-level coursework. The corruption surrounding Cole extended beyond academics into recruiting violations and eligibility fraud. His father owned 3 car dealerships and had been making substantial donations to Millfield, academy that coincidentally aligned with Cole's improved academic performance. The paper trail was extensive, documenting a clear quid pro quo arrangement that violated both NCAA regulations and federal education guidelines. Derek Stone's nervousness was becoming more apparent as the seconds ticked by. His family's pharmaceutical company had been under investigation by the FDA for marketing violations, and his presence at Millfield Academy was part of a broader pattern of wealthy families using elite, private schools to rehabilitate their reputations. His grades had been systematically adjusted to ensure admission to medical school programs, where family connections could secure his future despite academic shortcomings. The 3 boys represented different aspects of the corruption Victoria had been investigating. Ethan embodied the administrative abuse of power. Cole represented athletic fraud. And Derek exemplified the medical and pharmaceutical industry's infiltration of educational institutions. Together, they formed a perfect case study in how privilege operated to undermine meritocracy. Victoria's silence was strategic, allowing them to become increasingly uncomfortable with her lack of response. Military interrogation training had taught her that subjects often revealed more when trying to fill uncomfortable silences than when responding to direct questions. The longer she remained calm, the more likely they were to escalate in ways that would provide additional evidence of their criminal behavior. Ethan's confidence began showing hairline cracks as Victoria continued to stare at him without speaking. He'd expected tears, pleading, or anger, any emotional response that would confirm his control over the situation. Instead, he was facing someone who appeared to be analyzing him with the detached interest of a scientist studying an interesting specimen. The assessment wasn't far from accurate. Victoria was indeed studying him, cataloging micro-expressions and behavioral tells that would be useful in future interrogations. His left eye twitched when he was uncertain, his hands clenched when he felt challenged, and his voice rose slightly when his authority was questioned. These details would help prosecutors understand his psychological profile during the trials that would inevitably follow. Cole Manning broke first, his discomfort with the silence manifesting in aggressive movement. He stepped forward, invading Victoria's personal space with the casual assumption that his physical presence would intimidate her into compliance. His 6'4" frame had been effective at overwhelming opponents on the football field, but Victoria had trained with special forces operators who made Cole look like an amateur. The football player's approach triggered protocols Victoria had learned during close-quarters combat training. Maintain visual contact with all potential threats, identify escape routes, assess available weapons, prepare for multiple attack vectors. Cole's movement had been telegraphed from 3 steps away, giving her ample time to calculate appropriate responses. Derek Stone's anxiety increased proportionally with Cole's aggression. Unlike his companions, Derek possessed enough intelligence to recognize that their situation was spiraling beyond their control. His pharmaceutical background had exposed him to legal liability concepts that Ethan and Cole barely understood. The difference between misdemeanor mischief and felony assault was becoming increasingly relevant to their current actions. Victoria's mental chronometer marked 47 seconds since the dress had torn. Enough time for her backup to receive the automated alert triggered by elevated stress, indicators in her biometric monitoring system. The device concealed in her collar wasn't just recording audio. It was transmitting real-time physiological data that would summon assistance if predetermined thresholds were exceeded. Agent Mark Sullivan would be receiving those alerts in his surveillance van positioned 3 blocks from the school. Former Delta Force, current Department of Education investigator, and Victoria's partner for this operation, Sullivan had been monitoring the situation since she'd first identified the corruption at Millfield Academy. His tactical team was already in motion, following protocols they'd rehearsed extensively. The beauty of their operational design lay in its redundancy. Even if Victoria's cover was completely blown, the evidence they'd gathered would still result in successful prosecutions. But maintaining that cover until the last possible moment would maximize the intelligence they could gather and minimize the chance of evidence destruction by panic-stricken conspirators. Ethan's second attempt at intimidation involved moving to her other side, creating a triangular formation that would have been effective against someone without tactical training. Unfortunately for him, Victoria had spent 2 years learning to survive situations where she was outnumbered by hostile forces with lethal weapons. 3 unarmed teenagers posed significantly less threat than Taliban fighters with automatic rifles. The positioning did serve her purposes by ensuring all 3 subjects were now within the optimal recording range of the classroom security cameras. Their faces were clearly visible, their actions were being documented from multiple angles, and their voices would be captured with sufficient clarity for voice analysis software to create positive identifications. Victoria's peripheral vision caught movement in the hallway beyond the classroom door. Emma Walsh was approaching, probably hoping to discuss the assignment Victoria had given her about identifying logical fallacies and political rhetoric. The timing was problematic, as Emma's presence would complicate the tactical situation and potentially put an innocent student at risk. The decision matrix was instantaneous. Allow Emma to enter and witness the assault, potentially traumatizing her but providing an additional witness, or take action now to prevent her involvement while sacrificing some evidential value. Victoria's protective instincts, honed through years of safeguarding civilian populations in conflict zones, made the choice inevitable. Emma's footsteps were approaching the door when Victoria finally spoke, her voice carrying none of the fear or submission her assailants expected. Instead, it held the calm authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone conversational despite the circumstances, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about who you're dealing with." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Ethan's expression shifted from confidence to confusion, his mind struggling to process a response that didn't fit his expectations. Cole's phone wavered slightly as he tried to reconcile Victoria's demeanor with the helpless victim narrative they'd constructed. Derek Stone's pharmaceutical training had apparently included some psychology because his face went pale as he recognized the change in Victoria's body language. Whatever he saw in her posture triggered an immediate flight response, but his position near the door meant any sudden movement would intersect with Emma's approach. Victoria's next words were chosen specifically to prevent Emma from entering the classroom while simultaneously establishing the legal framework for what would follow. Military training had emphasized the importance of creating clear verbal evidence of intent and threat assessment for post-action reviews. "You should also know that everything you've done in the last 60 seconds constitutes multiple federal crimes," she continued, her gaze moving deliberately from one boy to another. "Assault on a federal officer, interference with an ongoing investigation, and destruction of government property." The silence that followed was qualitatively different from the earlier pause. This wasn't the expectant quiet of predators savoring their prey. It was the stunned realization that their fundamental assumptions about the situation might be catastrophically wrong. Ethan's mouth opened and closed without sound, his brain attempting to process the implications of her words. Federal officer? Ongoing investigation? Government property? Each phrase challenged the narrative he'd constructed about intimidating a helpless teacher into compliance with his academic demands. Cole Manning's athletic reflexes were the first to adapt to the changing circumstances. His football training emphasized rapid response to unexpected defensive formations, and some part of his mind recognized that their offensive strategy had just encountered an insurmountable obstacle. The phone in his hand suddenly felt less like a weapon and more like evidence of his own culpability. Derek Stone's chemical knowledge included sufficient legal awareness to understand that federal charges carried consequences far beyond his father's pharmaceutical money could ameliorate. His face had progressed from pale to ashen as he calculated the potential impact on his medical school applications and future licensing prospects. Victoria used their momentary paralysis to continue her psychological operation. Military doctrine emphasized that disorientation was most effective when followed immediately by clear commands that offered apparent escape routes while actually tightening control over the situation. "However," she said, allowing a note of apparent reasonableness to enter her voice, "there's still an opportunity to resolve this situation with minimal consequences for everyone involved." The word minimal was carefully chosen. Not no consequences which would lack credibility, but minimal, which suggested negotiation was possible. Ethan's face showed the first signs of hope, a reaction Victoria had observed in numerous interrogation subjects when presented with apparent lifelines. Cole Manning seized on the implied offer with the desperation of someone watching his Stanford scholarship evaporate in real time. "What kind of resolution?" he asked, his voice betraying the fear he was trying to suppress. Victoria smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "The kind that involves full cooperation with an ongoing federal investigation into academic fraud, financial corruption, and abuse of power at this institution." Derek Stone's legs gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair as the full scope of their situation became clear. They hadn't just assaulted a teacher. They'd attacked a federal investigator who'd been building a case against the entire system that protected them. Emma Walsh's footsteps had stopped outside the door, suggesting she'd overheard enough of the conversation to realize something serious was happening. Victoria made a mental note to ensure the girl received appropriate counseling and protection, as her knowledge of the situation would make her a valuable witness and potential target for retaliation. The sound of approaching vehicles in the parking lot confirmed that Agent Sullivan's team was arriving. Victoria's biometric alerts had triggered the cavalry, and within minutes, Millfield Academy would be swarming with federal agents armed with search warrants and arrest authorization. Ethan Blackwood's world was about to collapse in ways his privileged upbringing had never prepared him to handle. His father's position as principal wouldn't protect him from federal prosecution. His family's wealth wouldn't buy his way out of charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences. And his assumption that teachers were powerless victims was about to be shattered by 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Victoria checked her watch. 93 seconds since the dress had torn. In less than 2 minutes, 3 young men had progressed from confident predators to terrified criminals facing federal prosecution. The transformation would have been fascinating from an academic perspective if the consequences weren't so severe for everyone involved. The approaching vehicles were now audible even inside the classroom. Derek Stone was hyperventilating. Cole Manning was staring at his phone like it had become a venomous snake. And Ethan Blackwood was beginning to understand that his father's authority ended at the school district boundary. Victoria straightened her torn dress as much as possible and prepared to transition from undercover operative to federal prosecutor. The investigation phase was complete. Now came the reckoning that would transform not just Millfield Academy, but the entire network of corruption that had operated in the shadows for far too long. Outside, Emma Walsh was probably wondering whether she should seek help or flee the scene. Her decision would be made for her shortly when federal agents secured the building and began processing witnesses. Victoria made another mental note to ensure Emma received recognition for her unwitting assistance in the investigation. The 5 words were ready, practiced during countless rehearsals and refined through operational experience. They would serve multiple purposes: establishing Victoria's authority, legally protecting her actions, and psychologically devastating her assailants' remaining confidence. But first, she wanted to watch them realize that their comfortable world of privilege and impunity was about to end forever. The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the parking lot like thunderclaps announcing an approaching storm. Victoria counted 6 distinct impacts, suggesting a full tactical team deployment rather than a simple backup response. Agent Sullivan was taking no chances with her safety, which meant he'd activated the full federal response protocol they'd established for high-risk situations. Ethan Blackwood's face cycled through expressions like a broken television switching channels. Confusion gave way to denial, denial to anger, and anger to the first pale stirrings of genuine fear. His world had operated on the simple principle that his father's authority could solve any problem, but federal jurisdiction existed beyond Principal Blackwood's reach. Cole Manning had lowered his phone completely, his quarterback instincts finally recognizing that their offensive play had encountered an immovable defense. The device that had been their weapon of intimidation now felt like radioactive material in his hands. Every second of footage they'd captured was evidence of their own criminal behavior, documentation that would be used against them in federal court. Derek Stone's pharmaceutical background had apparently included enough legal training to understand the cascading implications of their situation. Federal charges meant federal prison. Federal prison meant professional licensing boards would be notified. And licensing board notifications meant his medical career was finished before it started. The domino effect was already in motion, each consequence triggering the next in an unstoppable chain. Victoria's tactical assessment registered footsteps in the hallway, approaching at a measured pace. Not the running steps of panicked students or the hurried gait of concerned teachers, but the deliberate movement of professionals executing a planned operation. Agent Sullivan's team was in the building, moving through predetermined positions to secure all exits and establish control zones. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. These three young men had spent their entire lives believing that wealth and privilege created immunity from consequences. They'd systematically destroyed other students' futures, corrupted academic integrity, and used violence to maintain their dominance. Now they were about to discover that federal law enforcement operated according to different rules than their private school hierarchy. Emma Walsh's footsteps had retreated down the hallway, suggesting the girl possessed enough survival instinct to recognize danger when she encountered it. Victoria felt relief knowing that Emma wouldn't be present for what was about to unfold. The girl had already provided valuable intelligence about the corruption at Millfield Academy. There was no need to traumatize her further by witnessing the arrests. Ethan made his first tactical error by attempting to reassert control through familiar patterns of intimidation. He stepped closer to Victoria, his voice dropping to the threatening whisper that had probably terrorized previous victims into compliance. "You think you're clever, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. My father owns this place, and he owns people who can make your life very difficult." The threat was perfect for Victoria's purposes, providing clear audio evidence of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. Her recording device captured every nuance of his tone, creating documentation that would be admissible in federal court. Ethan was systematically destroying any possibility of plea negotiations with each word he spoke. Cole Manning recognized the deteriorating situation and attempted damage control with the blunt pragmatism of someone accustomed to salvaging bad plays. "Look, maybe we all got carried away here. Nobody needs to involve federal anything. We can work this out between ourselves like reasonable people." Victoria almost smiled at the attempted de-escalation. Cole's football experience had taught him to recognize when a play was failing, but his proposed solution demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of their circumstances. Federal investigations weren't recreational activities that could be canceled when they became inconvenient for the subjects. Derek Stone remained silent, his chemistry background apparently providing enough scientific method to recognize that their experimental approach to intimidation had produced catastrophic results. Unlike his companions, he seemed to grasp that the situation had moved beyond negotiation into consequence management. His pharmaceutical training had probably exposed him to regulatory enforcement actions that followed similar patterns. The footsteps in the hallway had multiplied, suggesting Agent Sullivan's team was establishing a perimeter around room 204. Victoria could hear the subtle sounds of professionals communicating through encrypted radio systems, the efficient coordination of personnel who'd executed hundreds of similar operations. The net was closing with military precision. Victoria's next words were chosen to maximize psychological impact while providing additional legal foundation for the charges that would follow. Military interrogation training had emphasized the importance of maintaining verbal pressure while suspects were disoriented, extracting admissions before they could construct defensive narratives. "Your father's influence is actually part of the problem," she said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to confused children. Principal Blackwood's systematic abuse of his authority is what triggered this federal investigation in the first place. His attempts to protect you and your friends have only made the charges more severe. Ethan's face flushed red as the implications registered. His father wasn't a solution to their problem. Principal Blackwood was the central figure in a corruption network that stretched across multiple institutions. Every attempt to use family influence would only provide additional evidence of the conspiracy they'd been documenting for months. Cole Manning's athletic background had taught him to read defensive formations, and he was finally beginning to understand the scope of the opposition they faced. "How long have you been investigating us?" he asked, his voice betraying the growing realization that their actions had been monitored and documented extensively. Victoria's smile was entirely professional, devoid of warmth or reassurance. "Long enough to build cases that will survive any appeal process your family's attorneys might attempt. Federal prosecutors don't bring charges unless they're confident of conviction." Derek Stone's pharmaceutical training had included enough regulatory compliance to understand what federal conviction meant for his future prospects. Medical licensing boards conducted comprehensive background checks, and federal felony convictions created automatic disqualification from most healthcare professions. His carefully planned career path was evaporating in real time. The sound of the main entrance being secured echoed through the building, suggesting Agent Sullivan's team had established full control of Millfield Academy. Victoria could hear the efficient deployment of personnel to strategic positions, the professional coordination of law enforcement officers who understood the importance of preventing evidence, destruction, or witness intimidation. Ethan made his second critical error by attempting to invoke his father's authority as if Principal Blackwood's position could somehow override federal jurisdiction. "When my father finds out about this, he's going to have your badge. Nobody conducts investigations at his school without his permission." Victoria's response was measured, each word chosen for maximum impact on both her immediate audience and the recording devices that would preserve this conversation for posterity. "Your father has been under federal surveillance for 6 months. His permission became irrelevant the moment we obtained warrants from the federal district court." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with the collapse of assumptions that had shaped their entire worldview. Federal surveillance meant their family conversations had been monitored, their financial transactions had been analyzed, and their attempts at evidence destruction had been anticipated and prevented. Cole Manning's quarterback training had taught him to recognize when the pocket was collapsing and escape was necessary, but his current situation offered no tactical alternatives. Federal agents in the hallway meant retreat was impossible. Documented evidence meant denial was futile, and the scope of the investigation meant negotiation was unlikely to succeed. Victoria used their momentary paralysis to continue her psychological operation, providing information that would maximize their cooperation while minimizing the chance of additional criminal behavior. Military doctrine emphasized that subjects were most compliant when they understood both the futility of resistance and the potential benefits of cooperation. "The investigation extends far beyond Millfield Academy," she continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the devastating content of her words. "We've identified similar operations at 17 other institutions across 4 states. Your actions today were just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise." Derek Stone's face had progressed from pale to gray as he calculated the implications of a multi-state federal investigation. Pharmaceutical companies face severe penalties for regulatory violations, and his father's business would be scrutinized for any connections to the academic fraud network. The family's wealth and social standing would provide no protection from federal prosecutors seeking to make examples of high-profile defendants. The approaching footsteps had reached the hallway outside room 204, accompanied by the low murmur of radio communications and tactical coordination. Agent Sullivan's voice was distinguishable among the others, his Delta Force training evident in the calm efficiency with which he directed the operation. Victoria checked her chronometer again. 2 minutes and 37 seconds since the dress had torn. In less than 3 minutes, these young men had progressed from confident predators to federal defendants facing decades in prison. The transformation would have been remarkable if the human cost weren't so devastating for everyone involved. Ethan's desperation manifested in one final attempt to assert dominance through physical intimidation. He stepped directly into Victoria's personal space, his face inches from hers, apparently believing that masculine aggression could somehow override federal authority. The movement triggered every tactical protocol Victoria had learned during her military service. Close-quarters combat training activated automatically as Ethan's proximity crossed the threshold. That defined immediate threat assessment. Victoria's muscle memory cataloged his stance, balance, and potential attack vectors, while her conscious mind calculated appropriate responses that would neutralize the threat without exceeding necessary force parameters. But before she could implement any physical countermeasures, the classroom door opened with the quiet authority of professionals who'd timed their entry for maximum psychological impact. Agent Sullivan appeared in the doorway, his 6'2" frame filling the space with the calm presence of someone completely comfortable with dangerous situations. Behind Sullivan, 2 additional agents took positions that provided optimal coverage of the room while maintaining clear fields of fire. Their tactical gear was minimal but professional, designed to project authority rather than intimidation. These weren't militarized police officers seeking confrontation. They were federal investigators executing a carefully planned operation. Victoria felt the familiar relief of cavalry arriving at precisely the right moment. Sullivan's timing was perfect, providing her with tactical support while allowing the subjects to incriminate themselves as thoroughly as possible. The operation was proceeding exactly according to their predetermined script. Ethan's reaction to the federal presence was immediate and catastrophic for his legal prospects. Instead of compliance or respectful silence, he chose aggressive confrontation with sworn law enforcement officers. "You can't just walk into our school. This is private property, and you don't have permission to be here." Agent Sullivan's response was delivered with the patient professionalism of someone who'd dealt with entitled defendants countless times before. "Actually, we have federal warrants authorizing us to search these premises and arrest specific individuals for crimes against the United States." Cole Manning's athletic reflexes finally recognized the hopelessness of their situation. His shoulders sagged as he accepted that their offensive play had not only failed but resulted in a devastating defensive counterattack. The phone in his hand was no longer a weapon. It was evidence that would be used to prosecute him in federal court. Derek Stone's pharmaceutical background had included enough chemistry to understand irreversible reactions, and he was watching his future undergo molecular decomposition in real time. Every word spoken, every action taken, every decision made was catalyzing consequences that couldn't be neutralized through money or influence. Victoria straightened her torn dress and prepared to transition from undercover operative to prosecuting witness. The investigation phase was complete, the evidence was secured, and the subjects were in custody. Now came the moment she'd been rehearsing for months, the 5 words that would formally end their reign of impunity. Agent Sullivan's eyes met hers, seeking confirmation that she was ready to drop her cover and assume her official role in the prosecution. Victoria nodded slightly, a gesture that communicated volumes about the success of their operation and the strength of the cases they'd built. The 5 words had been carefully chosen for maximum legal and psychological impact. They would establish her authority, justify her actions, and psychologically devastate any remaining resistance from the defendants. Military training had emphasized the importance of decisive verbal action in moments when physical confrontation became inevitable. Ethan Blackwood was still attempting to assert his father's authority when Victoria spoke the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone revealing their true nature after months of careful deception. Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're done. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Derek Stone's chair scraping against the floor as he slumped forward in complete defeat. 5 simple words had transformed the entire dynamic of the situation, revealing that their victim was actually their prosecutor and their school was actually a crime scene. Ethan's face went through the entire spectrum of human emotion in the space of 3 seconds. Confusion, denial, anger, bargaining, and finally acceptance of a reality that destroyed every assumption he'd ever made about power, privilege, and consequences. Cole Manning dropped his phone as if it had become molten metal, the device clattering across the floor like the sound of his Stanford scholarship disappearing forever. The recording that was supposed to be their insurance policy had become evidence of assault on a federal officer. Agent Sullivan moved forward with practiced efficiency, producing credentials that confirmed Victoria's declaration while simultaneously beginning the arrest procedures that would formally end their academic careers and begin their journey through the federal criminal justice system. Victoria felt the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully, but also the weight of responsibility for what would happen to these young men. They'd made choices that required consequences, but she'd played a role in shaping those choices through her undercover operation. The torn dress was evidence now, physical proof of assault that would be photographed, analyzed, and presented to a federal grand jury. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate a teacher had become documentation of federal crimes that would change lives forever. Emma Walsh's voice could be heard in the hallway, apparently providing information to additional agents about the pattern of harassment she'd witnessed. The girl's courage in speaking up would be instrumental in establishing the systematic nature of the abuse that had been normalized at Millfield Academy. Principal Blackwood's voice echoed from somewhere else in the building, his tone suggesting he was discovering that his authority meant nothing to federal agents executing valid warrants. The corruption network was being dismantled simultaneously across multiple locations, each arrest triggering additional searches and seizures. Victoria looked at the 3 young men who'd entered room 204 as confident predators and were now facing federal prosecution as documented criminals. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and entirely the result of choices they'd made freely. The 5 words had done their job. Now came justice. The Miranda rights echoed through room 204 with the solemnity of a funeral dirge. Agent Sullivan's voice was steady and professional as he informed each young man of their constitutional protections, but the words seemed to bounce off them like stones thrown into an abyss. Ethan Blackwood stared at the federal badge in Sullivan's hand as if it were an artifact from an alien civilization, his mind struggling to process a reality where his father's influence held no power. Cole Manning had progressed beyond shock into a catatonic state that Victoria recognized from battlefield trauma cases. His brain had simply shut down rather than confront the complete destruction of his carefully constructed future. The Stanford scholarship, the NFL dreams, the comfortable life of privilege, all of it was evaporating as Agent Sullivan methodically documented their crimes with the efficiency of someone who'd processed hundreds of similar cases. Derek Stone was hyperventilating now, his pharmaceutical training providing him with enough medical knowledge to recognize his own physiological response to extreme stress. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that his chemistry background was helping him understand exactly how his body was reacting to the realization that his medical career was over before it had begun. Agent Sullivan's team moved through the room with choreographed precision, photographing evidence, collecting the torn fabric of Victoria's dress, and securing the phones that contained documentation of their assault. Every action was performed according to federal protocols that would ensure the evidence remained admissible through multiple levels of appeal. These agents understood that wealthy defendants hired expensive lawyers who would challenge every procedural detail. Victoria watched the process with professional interest, noting how Sullivan's military background influenced his approach to evidence collection. Delta Force training emphasized thoroughness and attention to detail, qualities that translated perfectly to federal investigation work. Every photograph was taken from multiple angles, every piece of evidence was properly tagged and documented, and every procedure was executed according to guidelines that had been tested in federal court. The sound of additional arrests echoed through the building as other teams simultaneously apprehended Principal Blackwood and the teachers who'd participated in the grade manipulation scheme. Victoria could hear raised voices from the administrative wing, where Robert Blackwood was apparently discovering that his position as principal provided no immunity from federal prosecution. His attempts to assert authority over federal agents would only add obstruction charges to his already extensive criminal liability. Emma Walsh appeared in the doorway, accompanied by Agent Rodriguez, who'd been assigned to interview student witnesses. The girl's eyes were wide with shock as she took in the scene of 3 classmates being arrested by federal agents, but Victoria could see the underlying relief in her expression. Emma had endured months of harassment and intimidation, watching helplessly as the system failed to protect honest students from systematic corruption. Agent Rodriguez was documenting Emma's statement about the pattern of harassment she'd witnessed, her testimony providing crucial evidence of the systematic nature of the crimes. Emma's courage in speaking up would be instrumental in establishing that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader campaign of intimidation designed to protect the corruption network. Ethan's shock was finally giving way to anger as the reality of his situation penetrated his privileged worldview. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You can't destroy our lives over some stupid grades. Do you know who our families are? Do you understand what you're doing?" Victoria found his outburst fascinating from a psychological perspective. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, Ethan's first instinct was to invoke family status as if wealth could somehow override federal law. His entire identity was built on the assumption that consequences were for other people, that his father's position created an invisible shield around his actions. Agent Sullivan's response was delivered with the patience of someone who'd heard similar protests countless times before. "Mr. Blackwood, your family status is precisely why this investigation was prioritized. When people in positions of trust abuse that trust, it undermines the entire educational system." Cole Manning finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What about Stanford? What about my scholarship?" The question revealed the depth of his delusion. He was still thinking about maintaining his college prospects even as federal agents documented his assault on a law enforcement officer. Victoria felt a mixture of pity and professional satisfaction as she watched the reality slowly penetrate Cole's consciousness. His athletic ability had earned him genuine opportunities, but his family's decision to supplement his achievements with systematic fraud had contaminated everything he'd accomplished. The corruption had been so normalized in his world that he'd never questioned whether his grades reflected his actual academic ability. Derek Stone had recovered enough from his panic attack to ask more practical questions. "How long have you been watching us? How much do you know?" His pharmaceutical background had taught him to think in terms of data and evidence, and he was trying to calculate the scope of their exposure. Victoria decided to answer his questions, partly out of professional courtesy and partly to encourage cooperation that might mitigate some of the damage to their futures. The investigation began 14 months ago when statistical analysis identified irregular patterns in college admission data from this region. Your school's graduates were performing significantly better in college applications than their actual academic abilities suggested. The revelation that their crimes had been detected through data analysis rather than insider complaints seemed to shock them further. They'd assumed their activities were invisible because no individual had reported them, never considering that federal investigators use sophisticated analytical tools to identify corruption patterns. Agent Sullivan was completing the arrest procedures with methodical efficiency, ensuring that each defendant's rights were protected while simultaneously building an airtight case for prosecution. His military background had taught him that tactical victories were meaningless if they couldn't be sustained through the legal process that followed. Victoria pulled out her credentials, revealing the badge and identification that transformed her from victim to prosecutor in their eyes. Special Agent Victoria Kane, Department of Education Office of Inspector General, detailed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division. You've been under federal surveillance since I arrived at the school 3 weeks ago. The impact of her revelation rippled through the room like a shockwave. Ethan's face went through several color changes as he realized that every conversation, every threat, every act of intimidation had been documented by a federal agent. Cole Manning's hands began shaking as he understood that his phone contained evidence of assault on a law enforcement officer. Derek Stone closed his eyes, apparently calculating the mathematical probability of avoiding federal conviction. Emma Walsh's expression showed pure admiration as she watched Victoria transform from the nervous teacher she'd tried to help into the confident federal agent who'd brought down the corruption network that had tormented honest students for years. The girl's courage in speaking up had provided valuable intelligence, but Victoria's professional investigation had provided the evidence necessary for prosecution. Agent Rodriguez finished documenting Emma's statement and approached Victoria with a preliminary report. We've secured 17 additional student witnesses who are ready to testify about the systematic harassment and grade manipulation. The computer forensics team has recovered deleted files showing parallel grading systems going back 3 years. Victoria nodded, unsurprised by the scope of evidence they were uncovering. Academic fraud investigations typically revealed far more extensive corruption than initially suspected because the perpetrators became overconfident and sloppy over time. The systematic nature of the crimes meant that digital evidence would be extensive and difficult to challenge in court. Principal Blackwood's voice could be heard from the hallway as he was led away in handcuffs, his protests about his position and authority falling on deaf ears. Federal agents were immune to local political pressure, and his attempts to invoke his connections would only provide additional evidence of the corruption network they'd been investigating. The torn dress that had started this confrontation was being carefully packaged as evidence, each piece of fabric tagged and photographed for presentation to a federal grand jury. What Ethan had intended as humiliation had become proof of assault on a federal officer, a charge that carried serious prison time and couldn't be plea bargained away easily. Victoria looked at the 3 young men who'd entered room 204 as confident predators and were now federal defendants facing decades in prison. Their transformation was complete and irreversible, the result of choices they'd made freely despite having every advantage society could provide. Agent Sullivan completed the arrest procedures and began preparing to transport the defendants to federal holding facilities where they would await arraignment. The efficiency of the process reflected years of experience with similar cases, but Victoria could see the human cost in the faces of 3 young men whose lives had been irrevocably changed by their own actions. Cole Manning asked one final question that revealed his continuing inability to grasp the scope of his situation. Can we call our parents? Can they post bail? He was still thinking in terms of local law enforcement, where family influence and financial resources could provide immediate relief. Agent Sullivan's response was gentle but definitive. Federal charges require federal magistrates. Your parents are currently being arrested on related charges, so they'll be dealing with their own legal issues. You'll have access to attorneys, but the bail process is different for federal defendants. The reality that their families were also under arrest seemed to break the last of their psychological defenses. Ethan slumped against the wall. Cole Manning began crying quietly, and Derek Stone stared at the floor in complete defeat. The corruption network they believed was impenetrable had been systematically dismantled by federal investigators who operated beyond the reach of local influence. Victoria felt the familiar mixture of professional satisfaction and human sympathy that came with successful undercover operations. These young men had committed serious crimes that required serious consequences, but they were also products of a system that had taught them that wealth and privilege created immunity from accountability. Emma Walsh approached Victoria as the defendants were being led away, her expression showing a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "I can't believe you were FBI the whole time. When you helped me with my college application essay, were you really trying to help, or was that part of your investigation?" Victoria's response was immediate and sincere. "I was really trying to help. Your essay was excellent, and you deserve every opportunity you've earned through your own hard work. That's what this investigation was ultimately about, protecting students like you from systematic corruption." Agent Rodriguez was coordinating with the computer forensics team to ensure all digital evidence was properly secured before the defendants' families could attempt any evidence destruction. Federal investigations of white-collar crime required extensive documentation, and any gaps in the evidence chain could be exploited by expensive defense attorneys. The sound of news vans arriving in the parking lot suggested that word of the arrests had reached the media. Federal investigations of educational corruption typically generated significant public interest, especially when they involved wealthy families and prestigious institutions. Victoria made a mental note to coordinate with the FBI's Public Affairs Office to ensure accurate reporting that wouldn't compromise ongoing investigations. Principal Blackwood's office was being systematically searched by agents equipped with specialized equipment for detecting hidden documents and electronic storage devices. White-collar criminals often maintained backup records of their activities, either for blackmail purposes or as insurance against potential partners who might consider cooperation with law enforcement. Victoria changed out of her torn dress and into the professional attire she'd kept in her car for this moment. The transformation from victim to prosecutor was complete, marked by the FBI badge she pinned to her jacket and the service weapon she holstered at her hip. Her undercover role was officially over, and her prosecutorial responsibilities were beginning. Agent Sullivan approached with preliminary damage assessments from other locations where simultaneous arrests had occurred. "We've arrested 23 individuals across 4 institutions, seized 17 computer systems, and frozen 14 bank accounts. The Financial Crimes Unit estimates the total fraud at approximately $47 million over 6 years. The scope of the corruption was staggering, even by federal standards. What had begun as simple grade manipulation had evolved into a sophisticated money laundering operation that reached across state lines and involved multiple criminal enterprises. The defendants in room 204 had been small components in a much larger criminal network. Victoria reviewed the preliminary evidence inventory, noting the extensive documentation that would support prosecution efforts. Phone records, financial transactions, email communications, and witness statements provided multiple avenues for proving criminal intent and systematic conspiracy. Defense attorneys would find little room for reasonable doubt arguments. Emma Walsh was being interviewed by victim services specialists who would ensure she received appropriate counseling and protection from potential retaliation. Her testimony would be crucial in establishing the systematic nature of the harassment that had been used to silence honest students, but her safety was the primary concern. The classroom that had been the scene of assault and revelation was now a federal crime scene, with evidence markers indicating where each piece of physical evidence had been located. Crime scene photographers were documenting every detail that might be relevant to prosecution, creating a visual record that would help juries understand exactly what had occurred. Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Helen Price, her former colonel who now headed the Department of Education's investigative division. The text was brief but significant. "Excellent work. Congressional hearing scheduled for next month. Your testimony will help reform educational oversight nationwide. The investigation that had begun with statistical anomalies in college admission data was about to trigger federal legislation that would transform how educational institutions were monitored and regulated. Victoria's undercover work had provided the evidence necessary to convince Congress that systematic reform was needed to protect academic integrity. Agent Sullivan was coordinating with federal prosecutors to ensure the arrest warrants and search warrants were executed according to legal requirements that would survive appellate challenges. Wealthy defendants hired expensive attorneys who specialized in finding procedural errors that could invalidate evidence or dismiss charges. The media presence outside was growing as word spread about the federal raids at multiple educational institutions. Victoria could see news helicopters circling overhead, their cameras capturing images that would be broadcast nationwide within hours. The public attention would help pressure other institutions to examine their own practices before federal investigators arrived. Derek Stone's father arrived in the parking lot just as his son was being loaded into a federal transport vehicle. The pharmaceutical executive's expression showed the same shock and disbelief that had characterized his son's reaction to arrest. Wealth and influence provided no protection from federal prosecution, a lesson that powerful families learned only when it was too late to matter. Cole Manning's parents were already in federal custody at another location, their sports marketing company having been identified as a vehicle for laundering bribery payments disguised as legitimate business expenses. The systematic nature of the corruption meant that entire families had participated in criminal enterprises that they'd convinced themselves were simply aggressive advocacy for their children's futures. Victoria felt a deep sense of professional accomplishment as she watched the organized dismantling of a corruption network that had operated with impunity for years. Military training had taught her that successful operations required patience, careful planning, and precise execution. Today's arrests represented the culmination of months of dangerous undercover work that had finally produced justice for the honest students who'd been systematically victimized. Emma Walsh waved goodbye as she left with victim services personnel who would ensure her safety and provide ongoing support. The girl's courage in speaking up had helped expose corruption that might have continued for years without intervention. Her testimony would help ensure that the defendants received sentences that reflected the seriousness of their crimes. Agent Sullivan approached Victoria with final coordination details for the prosecution phase of their operation. Federal prosecutors want to meet with you tomorrow morning to begin preparation for grand jury proceedings. They're confident we can secure convictions on all major charges. Victoria nodded, already mentally preparing for the transition from investigator to witness. Federal prosecutions required extensive preparation and careful coordination between law enforcement and attorneys. Her testimony would need to be precise, detailed, and legally admissible under federal rules of evidence. The torn dress that had precipitated this confrontation was now evidence in a federal criminal case that would reshape educational oversight nationwide. Ethan Blackwood's attempt to humiliate a teacher had instead exposed a criminal network and triggered reforms that would protect honest students for generations to come. As the last of the defendants disappeared into federal transport vehicles, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her from Army intelligence specialist to undercover educator to federal prosecutor. Each role had required different skills, but all had been united by a commitment to protecting innocent people from those who would abuse positions of trust. The 5 words that had frozen Ethan Blackwood in place would be remembered long after his prison sentence was completed. Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're done. They represented the moment when privilege met accountability, when corruption encountered justice, and when 3 young men learned that consequences were real, regardless of family wealth or social position. The investigation was complete, the arrests had been made, and justice was finally being served. Victoria Kane had kept her promise to protect honest students from systematic corruption, and tomorrow she would begin the process of ensuring that those responsible faced the full consequences of their crimes. 6 months after the arrests at Millfield Academy, Victoria Kane stood before a packed congressional hearing room, her navy suit a stark contrast to the torn dress that had become evidence in one of the largest educational fraud cases in federal history. The mahogany-paneled chamber buzzed with anticipation as senators, journalists, and education officials prepared to hear testimony that would reshape American academic oversight forever. Chairman Senator Patricia Williams called the session to order, her voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the historical significance of what they were about to discuss. The Educational Integrity Reform Act had been fast-tracked through both houses of Congress following the shocking revelations from Operation Clean Slate, the code name federal investigators had assigned to Victoria's undercover mission. Victoria adjusted the microphone before her, glancing briefly at the gallery where Emma Walsh sat with her parents. The brave student who had risked everything to expose the corruption at Millfield Academy was now a freshman at MIT. Her full scholarship, earned through legitimate academic excellence rather than family connections or fraudulent grade manipulation. The statistics Victoria was about to present would stagger even seasoned lawmakers. Operation Clean Slate had ultimately resulted in 247 federal indictments across 23 states, the seizure of $89 million in fraudulent proceeds, and the exposure of corruption networks that had operated with impunity for over a decade. But behind every number was a human story of dreams destroyed, futures stolen, and trust betrayed. Senator Williams leaned forward, her expression reflecting both determination and disgust at what the investigation had revealed. Agent Kane, please describe for this committee how you first became aware of the systematic nature of educational fraud in our nation's elite institutions. Victoria's response was measured and professional, drawing on months of careful preparation with federal prosecutors. Senator, the investigation began when Department of Education analysts noticed statistical anomalies in college admission patterns. Students from certain high schools were significantly outperforming their standardized test scores once they reached university level, suggesting their high school grades had been artificially inflated. The explanation was deliberately technical, designed to help lawmakers understand that this wasn't isolated cheating but systematic manipulation of data that could only be detected through sophisticated analysis. The corruption had been so pervasive that it had created measurable distortions in national education statistics. Senator Robert Chun from California had been following the case closely, his own state having been particularly affected by the corruption network. Agent Kane, what role did technology play in both facilitating these crimes and ultimately exposing them? Victoria pulled up a prepared slide showing network diagrams that illustrated how the criminals had used encrypted communications, offshore banking, and parallel computer systems to hide their activities. The perpetrators believed technology made them invisible, but it actually created digital evidence trails that were far more comprehensive than traditional paper records. The technical sophistication of the operation had initially impressed federal investigators before horrifying them. Principal Blackwood and his co-conspirators had created systems that would have been admirable if applied to legitimate purposes, but instead had been used to systematically destroy academic integrity across multiple states. Senator Maria Rodriguez from Texas had been particularly vocal about the impact on Hispanic students who had been denied opportunities through the fraudulent system. What was the demographic impact of these crimes? Who were the real victims here? Victoria's response drew on extensive statistical analysis that had been conducted by Department of Education researchers. Senator, our investigation revealed that the fraud disproportionately affected minority students and those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Essentially, wealthy families were purchasing opportunities that should have gone to academically deserving students, regardless of their financial circumstances. The data was devastating. Thousands of qualified students had been denied college admissions, scholarships, and career opportunities because their legitimate achievements couldn't compete with artificially enhanced records from privileged classmates. The human cost of the corruption extended far beyond the immediate participants to include entire generations of students whose potential had been systematically suppressed. Emma Walsh had been invited to provide student perspective on the committee's second day of hearings, her testimony providing a human face to the statistical evidence Victoria presented. The young woman's courage in speaking truth to power had inspired dozens of other students to come forward with their own experiences of systematic harassment and academic fraud. The ripple effects of Operation Clean Slate were still expanding across American education. Universities had been forced to review thousands of admissions decisions, leading to retroactive scholarship awards for students who had been unfairly denied opportunities. Several major college admissions consulting firms had been shut down and their executives prosecuted for money laundering and fraud. Victoria's military training had prepared her for congressional testimony, understanding that lawmakers needed both detailed evidence and broader context to craft effective legislation. Her responses balanced technical accuracy with accessible explanations that would help the public understand why federal intervention had been necessary. Senator James Mitchell from New York had been skeptical of federal oversight of education, but the evidence presented during the hearings had changed his perspective dramatically. Agent Kane, what safeguards can prevent future corruption of this magnitude from developing undetected? Victoria's answer drew on recommendations developed by a joint task force of education officials, law enforcement professionals, and technology experts. Senator, the Educational Integrity Reform Act would establish automated monitoring systems that can detect statistical anomalies before they become systematic corruption. Early detection is far more effective than investigation after the damage is done. The proposed legislation would revolutionize how educational institutions were monitored, creating real-time oversight systems that could identify suspicious patterns within weeks rather than years. The technology existed. It simply needed to be implemented with appropriate legal authority and federal funding. Principal Robert Blackwood had ultimately received a 15-year federal sentence, his attempt to flee to Switzerland having been thwarted by international cooperation between law enforcement agencies. His son Ethan was serving 4 years in federal prison, his college prospects permanently destroyed by felony convictions for assault on a federal officer and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Cole Manning's story had taken a particularly tragic turn. His athletic ability had been genuine, but his family's decision to supplement it with fraudulent academic records had contaminated everything he'd achieved. Stanford had rescinded his scholarship, the NFL had declared him ineligible for future drafts, and his family's sports marketing company had been liquidated to pay restitution to fraud victims. Derek Stone had received the lightest sentence among the 3 defendants, his cooperation with federal investigators having helped expose connections to pharmaceutical industry corruption that extended the investigation into new areas. His medical career was finished, but his testimony had helped prosecutors build cases against executives who had been using educational fraud to launder money from drug pricing manipulation schemes. The pharmaceutical connection had been unexpected but significant, revealing how educational corruption served as a gateway to other forms of white-collar crime. Money laundering operations often used multiple seemingly legitimate institutions to obscure the sources and destinations of illegal funds. Victoria's testimony included recommendations for international cooperation, as the investigation had revealed that some of the corruption networks extended beyond American borders. Swiss banks, Caribbean shell companies, and European consulting firms had all played roles in the money laundering aspects of the educational fraud. Senator Patricia Williams was taking notes throughout Victoria's testimony, clearly preparing follow-up legislation that would address the international dimensions of educational fraud. The criminal networks had been sophisticated enough to require correspondingly sophisticated law enforcement responses. The hearing room's atmosphere had grown increasingly tense as Victoria described the systematic nature of the harassment used to silence potential whistleblowers. Teachers who questioned grade changes had been driven from their positions. Students who complained about unfair treatment had been systematically retaliated against. And parents who raised concerns had found their children targeted for additional harassment. Lisa Park, the teacher who had tried to report grade manipulation at Millfield Academy, was now working for the Department of Education as a specialist in identifying institutional retaliation against whistleblowers. Her experience had provided valuable insights into how corruption networks protected themselves through intimidation and fear. The congressional testimony was being broadcast live on C-SPAN and streamed online, reaching millions of Americans who were learning for the first time about the extent of educational corruption in their communities. Social media responses showed widespread shock and anger at the systematic nature of the fraud that had been exposed. Victoria's phone had been buzzing with messages from former military colleagues who were proud of her successful transition from Army intelligence to federal law enforcement. The skills she'd developed during overseas deployments had proven directly applicable to domestic investigations of sophisticated criminal networks. Dr. Helen Price, Victoria's former colonel, who now headed the Department of Education's investigative division, was watching from the gallery with obvious pride in her protégé's performance. The undercover operation at Millfield Academy had been Price's idea, but Victoria's execution had exceeded every expectation. Agent Mark Sullivan had been reassigned to lead a new task force focused on identifying similar corruption networks before they could become as sophisticated as the Millfield Academy operation. His Delta Force background had proven invaluable in coordinating complex multi-jurisdictional investigations that required military-style precision and planning. The financial recovery efforts were ongoing, with federal investigators still tracing money trails that led to offshore accounts and shell companies in multiple countries. The $89 million already seized represented only a portion of the total fraud proceeds, with additional assets being identified and frozen regularly. Victoria's testimony concluded with specific recommendations for legislative action that would prevent future corruption while protecting legitimate educational institutions from unnecessary federal interference. The balance between oversight and autonomy was delicate, requiring carefully crafted legislation that addressed real problems without creating new bureaucratic obstacles. Senator Rodriguez asked the final question that would be remembered long after the hearings concluded. Agent Kane, what message would you want to send to students across America who might be facing similar corruption in their own schools? Victoria's response drew on her military experience, her undercover work, and her fundamental belief in the power of individual courage to create systematic change. Senator, I would tell them that speaking up is never easy, but silence enables corruption to flourish. Every student who refuses to accept systematic unfairness helps protect the integrity of education for everyone. The hearing room erupted in sustained applause, with spectators rising to their feet in recognition of Victoria's courage and the broader principle she represented. Emma Walsh was crying openly, her own decision to speak up having been validated by the systematic changes that had resulted. The Educational Integrity Reform Act would pass both houses of Congress within 6 weeks, establishing permanent federal oversight mechanisms that would prevent future corruption while providing protection for whistleblowers who reported suspicious activities. The legislation represented a fundamental shift in how American education would be monitored and regulated. Victoria's transformation from undercover teacher to congressional witness demonstrated how individual acts of courage could trigger systematic reforms that protected entire generations of students. Her willingness to endure months of harassment and intimidation while gathering evidence had created changes that would outlast her own career. The torn dress from room 204 at Millfield Academy was now in the Smithsonian Institution, part of an exhibit on courage in law enforcement that would educate visitors about the importance of federal oversight in protecting individual rights. The fabric that Ethan Blackwood had intended as humiliation had become a symbol of justice prevailing over privilege. Emma Walsh approached Victoria after the hearing concluded, her gratitude evident but unnecessary. The young woman's courage had been instrumental in exposing the corruption, but more importantly, her example would inspire other students to speak up when they witnessed systematic unfairness in their own institutions. Victoria's next assignment would take her to the West Coast, where similar patterns of educational corruption had been identified through the monitoring systems established after Operation Clean Slate. The work would be ongoing, requiring constant vigilance to protect academic integrity from those who would exploit positions of trust for personal gain. The 5 words that had frozen Ethan Blackwood in place 6 months earlier had become a rallying cry for education reform advocates across the nation. Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're done. They represented the moment when systematic corruption encountered systematic justice, when privilege discovered that federal law applied to everyone regardless of wealth or social position. The congressional hearing concluded with bipartisan commitment to supporting the Educational Integrity Reform Act and providing adequate funding for the oversight mechanisms it would establish. The investigation that had begun with statistical anomalies in college admission data had evolved into fundamental reform of American educational oversight. Victoria gathered her materials and prepared to leave the hearing room, knowing that her testimony had helped create permanent protections for honest students across the nation. The work would continue, the vigilance would be maintained, and the principle that education should be based on merit rather than money would be protected by federal law. The story that had begun with fabric tearing in room 204 would end with legislation signed in the Oval Office, demonstrating how individual courage could create systematic change that protected future generations from similar corruption. Victoria Kane had kept her promise to defend those who couldn't defend themselves, and American education would be stronger because of her sacrifice. As she walked through the marble corridors of the Capitol building, Victoria reflected on the journey from Army intelligence specialist to federal prosecutor to congressional witness. Each role had required different skills, but all had been united by a commitment to protecting innocent people from systematic abuse of power. The investigation was complete, the legislation was pending, and justice had been served. Victoria Kane had proven that courage and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated corruption networks, and tomorrow she would begin protecting the next generation of students from similar systematic abuse. 5 years had passed since the Educational Integrity Reform Act became law, transforming American academic oversight in ways that continued to ripple through institutions nationwide. Victoria Kane stood in the morning light, streaming through her office windows at the Department of Justice, reviewing case files from the newest iteration of Operation Clean Slate, now expanded into a permanent federal program protecting students from systematic corruption. The manila folder in her hands contained evidence from Westbridge Preparatory in Connecticut, where automated monitoring systems had detected the familiar statistical anomalies that indicated grade manipulation. The technology developed after the Millfield Academy investigation had proven remarkably effective, identifying suspicious patterns within weeks rather than the years it had taken to uncover the original corruption network. Victoria's transformation from undercover agent to federal prosecutor had been seamless, her military intelligence background providing exactly the analytical skills needed to build complex white-collar crime cases. The courtroom had become her new battlefield, where she wielded evidence and legal precedent instead of tactical training and surveillance equipment. Emma Walsh had graduated summa cum laude from MIT the previous spring, her thesis on statistical fraud detection earning recognition from the National Science Foundation. The brave student who had risked everything to expose corruption at Millfield Academy was now developing the next generation of monitoring technologies that would protect future students from similar systematic abuse. The young woman had sent Victoria a handwritten note after her graduation ceremony, expressing gratitude that went far beyond professional appreciation. Emma's courage in speaking truth to power had inspired dozens of other students to come forward with their own experiences, creating a cascade effect that helped prosecutors build comprehensive cases against entire corruption networks. Dr. Helen Price had been promoted to Deputy Secretary of Education, her successful leadership of the investigative division having earned recognition at the highest levels of government. The former colonel's vision of proactive federal oversight had revolutionized how educational institutions were monitored, preventing countless instances of fraud before they could damage legitimate students' futures. Agent Mark Sullivan was now directing the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Educational Crimes Unit, a specialized division created specifically to handle the increasing number of cases generated by automated monitoring systems. His Delta Force background had proven invaluable in coordinating complex investigations that often spanned multiple states and involved sophisticated criminal networks. The Sullivan Unit had successfully prosecuted over 400 individuals in the 5 years since Millfield Academy, recovering more than $300 million in fraudulent proceeds while restoring opportunities to thousands of deserving students who had been systematically denied access to higher education. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from Lisa Park, the former Millfield Academy teacher who now served as a senior advisor in the Department of Education's Whistleblower Protection Program. Lisa's experience with institutional retaliation had helped design safeguards that encouraged reporting while protecting those who came forward with evidence of corruption. The message contained a photo from Lisa's wedding the previous weekend, where Victoria had served as maid of honor in a ceremony attended by dozens of educators who had found the courage to report suspicious activities in their own institutions. The network of reformed teachers had become an informal support system that helped newcomers navigate the challenges of standing up to systematic corruption. Principal Robert Blackwood had served 11 years of his 15-year sentence before dying of a heart attack in federal prison. His death had been unremarkable except for the journal investigators found in his cell, documenting his gradual understanding of the damage his corruption network had inflicted on innocent students and their families. The journal entries revealed a man who had started with small compromises that gradually escalated into systematic criminality, each step justified by increasingly elaborate rationalizations about protecting his institution and community. His descent into corruption provided valuable insights for prosecutors seeking to understand how respected educators could become sophisticated criminals. Ethan Blackwood had been released from federal prison after serving his full 4-year sentence, his felony convictions having permanently destroyed any prospect of higher education or professional employment. The young man who had once believed his father's position made him untouchable now worked in a warehouse, his college dreams replaced by the daily reality of consequences that money couldn't purchase away. Victoria had received a letter from Ethan 6 months after his release, a rambling apology that demonstrated genuine remorse mixed with continuing inability to fully comprehend the scope of damage his actions had caused. The letter remained in her desk drawer, a reminder that redemption was possible but not guaranteed, and that some consequences were designed to be permanent rather than educational. Cole Manning's story had taken a more tragic trajectory. His athletic ability had been genuine, but his family's decision to supplement it with fraudulent academic records had contaminated everything he might have achieved through legitimate effort. The young man had struggled with depression and substance abuse after his release from prison, his life permanently altered by decisions made when he believed privilege created immunity from accountability. The Manning family sports marketing company had never recovered from the federal investigation, its client base having disappeared when the money laundering convictions became public. Cole's parents had served concurrent sentences in minimum security facilities, but but their financial resources had been depleted by legal fees and restitution payments to fraud victims. Derek Stone had emerged from prison with a different perspective, his pharmaceutical background having helped him understand the systematic nature of the corruption he'd participated in. Unlike his former companions, Derek had used his incarceration productively, earning a paralegal certification that allowed him to work with defense attorneys representing white-collar crime defendants. Derek's transformation from privileged criminal to reformed advocate had been genuine, his testimony in subsequent cases helping prosecutors understand how corruption networks recruited and maintained the loyalty of participants. His insights had proven valuable in developing prevention programs that helped students recognize and resist systematic pressure to participate in academic fraud. Victoria's office walls displayed commendations from grateful parents whose children had benefited from the educational reforms triggered by Operation Clean Slate. Each certificate represented families who would never know how close their children had come to being victimized by corruption, networks that federal oversight had detected and dismantled before they could fully develop. The automated monitoring systems had evolved far beyond their original specifications, now incorporating artificial intelligence algorithms that could identify subtle patterns of manipulation that human analysts might miss. The technology had been licensed to international education organizations, extending American anti-corruption expertise to institutions worldwide. Victoria's latest case involved a network that had attempted to circumvent federal oversight by operating across international boundaries, using foreign consulting firms and offshore banking to obscure the money trails that had exposed previous corruption schemes. The criminals had underestimated how thoroughly federal investigators had learned to trace financial flows regardless of their complexity. The Westbridge preparatory investigation would likely result in another dozen federal indictments, adding to the growing body of case law that established clear legal precedents for prosecuting educational fraud. Each successful prosecution made subsequent cases easier to prove and more difficult for defense attorneys to challenge through procedural objections. Victoria's military training continued to inform her approach to complex white-collar investigations, the same analytical skills that had helped her survive dangerous overseas assignments, now serving to protect American students from systematic exploitation by trusted educational institutions. The torn dress from room 204 at Millfield Academy had indeed become part of the Smithsonian's collection, but more importantly, it had inspired a generation of young women to understand that courage often required enduring temporary humiliation to achieve lasting justice. School groups regularly visited the exhibit, learning about the importance of individual integrity in protecting institutional honesty. Emma Walsh had proposed using advanced statistical modeling to predict which institutions were most likely to develop corruption networks before any actual fraud occurred, a proactive approach that could prevent victimization rather than simply punishing it after the damage was done. The proposal was under consideration by a joint task force of education and law enforcement officials. Victoria's personal life had found balance in ways that military service and undercover work had never allowed. She had married Agent Rodriguez, the investigator who had interviewed Emma Walsh during the original Millfield Academy case. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Their wedding had been attended by dozens of students whose educational opportunities had been preserved through federal intervention in corruption cases. Emma Walsh had served as a bridesmaid, her presence symbolizing the continuing connection between individual courage and systematic reform. Victoria and Rodriguez had purchased a modest home in Virginia, close enough to Washington for their federal duties, but far enough from the city to provide respite from the intensity of white-collar crime investigation. Their weekend garden had become a source of therapeutic activity that helped balance the psychological demands of confronting human corruption professionally. The couple had decided against having children immediately, recognizing that their current assignments required travel and irregular schedules that would be incompatible with responsible parenting. But they had discussed adoption in the future, particularly of older children who had been affected by educational corruption and needed stable homes to recover from systematic trauma. Victoria's relationship with her parents had strengthened since the congressional testimony that had made her temporarily famous. Her father, a career Army officer, had expressed pride in her successful transition from military to civilian law enforcement. Her mother, a retired teacher, had been particularly moved by Victoria's commitment to protecting educational integrity. The 5 words that had frozen Ethan Blackwood in place had been quoted in dozens of speeches and articles about the importance of federal oversight in protecting individual rights. Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're done. They had become shorthand for the principle that wealth and privilege couldn't override federal law when systematic corruption was exposed through competent investigation. Victoria's next assignment would take her to the Pacific Northwest, where similar patterns of educational corruption had been detected in several prestigious private schools that served the children of technology executives. The investigation would likely reveal new variations on familiar themes, as criminals adapted their methods to avoid the detection systems that had exposed previous networks. The work would continue indefinitely, requiring constant vigilance to protect academic integrity from those who would exploit positions of trust for personal gain. But Victoria found satisfaction in knowing that her individual courage had created systematic changes that would protect countless students from the corruption that had once operated with impunity. The morning sun continued to stream through her office windows as Victoria prepared for another day of building cases that would preserve educational opportunity for deserving students regardless of their family's wealth or social connections. Justice required daily effort, but the results justified every sacrifice required to maintain it. The investigation that had begun with fabric tearing in a high school classroom had evolved into permanent federal oversight that would protect American education for generations to come. Victoria Kane had kept her promise to defend those who couldn't defend themselves, and tomorrow she would begin protecting the next group of students from similar systematic abuse. The story that had started with privilege confronting courage would continue wherever corruption threatened educational integrity, with federal agents trained in Victoria's methods standing ready to ensure that 5 simple words retained their power to transform systematic injustice into lasting accountability. The afternoon briefing at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Educational Crimes Unit brought news that would have been unthinkable during Victoria's undercover days at Millfield Academy. Agent Thompson, fresh from the field office in Seattle, presented evidence of a corruption network that had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, adapting their methods to avoid the detection systems that had exposed earlier schemes. Victoria studied the photographs spread across the conference table, recognizing patterns that had become disturbingly familiar over her 5 years of prosecuting educational fraud. Bank records showing payments disguised as charitable donations, grade changes that followed statistically improbable patterns, and communication logs revealing coordination between supposedly independent institutions. The Pacific Northwest investigation had uncovered something unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. Unlike the regional networks they'd dismantled previously, this operation spanned the entire West Coast and extended into international territories where American law enforcement faced jurisdictional limitations that criminals had learned to exploit. Agent Rodriguez, now Victoria's partner in both professional and personal contexts, highlighted the most troubling aspect of their latest discovery. They're using cryptocurrency transactions routed through multiple offshore exchanges to obscure the money trail. We're seeing blockchain technology being weaponized to facilitate academic fraud on a scale we've never encountered. Victoria's military intelligence background had prepared her for adversaries who adapted their tactics based on previous defeats, But the speed with which educational criminals had embraced emerging technologies was remarkable. Each successful prosecution had taught them valuable lessons about avoiding detection, creating an arms race between federal oversight and criminal innovation. Dr. Helen Price joined the briefing via secure video connection from her office in the Department of Education, her expression reflecting both pride in their past successes and concern about the evolving challenges they faced. The automated monitoring systems are detecting anomalies, but the perpetrators have become more sophisticated about creating plausible explanations for suspicious patterns. The cat-and-mouse game between investigators and criminals had entered a new phase where traditional evidence-gathering methods were insufficient to penetrate increasingly complex criminal enterprises. Victoria found herself drawing on skills she'd never expected to use again, the same analytical techniques that had helped her track terrorist financing networks in Afghanistan. Emma Walsh had completed her graduate studies and accepted a position with the National Security Agency. Her expertise in statistical fraud detection, having attracted attention from intelligence agencies dealing with financial crimes that threatened national security. The brave student who had risked everything to expose corruption at Millfield Academy was now developing countermeasures against state-sponsored efforts to undermine American educational institutions. Emma's transition from victim to federal investigator exemplified the broader transformation that had occurred throughout American education since Operation Clean Slate began. Students who had once felt powerless against systematic corruption now understood that federal law enforcement was both willing and able to protect their rights when institutional authorities failed them. Victoria's phone displayed a notification from the Supreme Court, where attorneys were preparing to argue a case that would determine the constitutional limits of federal oversight in educational institutions. The legal challenges had been inevitable once wealthy defendants exhausted their appeals in lower courts and turned to constitutional arguments about states' rights and institutional autonomy. The constitutional questions were complex, balancing legitimate federal authority to prevent fraud against equally legitimate concerns about federal overreach into traditionally local educational decisions. Victoria had testified before the court twice in the past year. Her expertise in both military intelligence and educational investigation, providing unique perspectives on the intersection of national security and academic integrity. Agent Sullivan's voice crackled through the conference room speakers as he reported from the field office in Portland, where simultaneous raids were being executed at 17 different institutions suspected of participating in the cryptocurrency-based fraud network. We've seized over 200 computer systems and arrested 43 individuals so far, but the investigation is revealing connections that extend far beyond what we initially suspected. The Portland raids represented the largest single-day enforcement action in the history of federal educational oversight, surpassing even the original Millfield Academy operation in terms of scope and complexity. Victoria felt the familiar mixture of professional satisfaction and human sympathy that came with successful operations against systematic corruption. Lisa Park had been promoted to Director of Whistleblower Protection Services, her experience with institutional retaliation having proven invaluable in designing safeguards that encouraged reporting while protecting those who came forward with evidence. Lisa's wedding photos still occupied a place of honor on Victoria's desk, a reminder that personal happiness was possible even after enduring systematic harassment and intimidation. The Whistleblower Protection Program had processed over 3,000 complaints in the past 5 years, resulting in federal investigations at more than 400 educational institutions nationwide. The success rate for prosecutions had remained consistently above 85%, reflecting both the quality of evidence provided by protected witnesses and the expertise federal investigators had developed in building these complex cases. Victoria's latest case file contained evidence from Westbridge Preparatory that suggested the Connecticut school had been operating as a testing ground for new corruption methods that were subsequently exported to other institutions. The criminals had learned to treat educational fraud as a research and development enterprise, constantly refining their techniques to stay ahead of federal detection systems. The technological sophistication of modern educational fraud required correspondingly advanced investigation methods, leading to partnerships between federal law enforcement and technology companies that specialized in blockchain analysis and cryptocurrency forensics. Victoria had spent the previous month training with specialists who could trace financial transactions through multiple layers of digital obfuscation. Principal Robert Blackwood's death in federal prison had been mourned by some community members who remembered his contributions to local education before his descent into corruption. But Victoria felt only professional closure at the conclusion of his case. His journal entries had provided valuable insights into the psychological progression from minor ethical compromises to systematic criminality. The journal had been extensively studied by behavioral analysts who were developing profiles to help identify educational administrators at risk of becoming corruption network leaders. Early intervention programs were being tested at several institutions where warning signs had been detected before any actual fraud occurred. Ethan Blackwood's warehouse job had become a cautionary tale frequently cited during educational integrity training sessions for high school students. The young man who had once believed his father's position made him untouchable now served as an example of how privilege, without accountability, could lead to permanent consequences that money couldn't ameliorate. Victoria had declined requests to visit Ethan during his incarceration, recognizing that such contact would serve no constructive purpose for either of them. His letter of apology remained in her desk drawer, not as forgiveness, but as documentation of how systematic corruption could devastate even the MIVO perpetrators who believed themselves immune from consequences. Cole Manning's struggle with depression and substance abuse had been documented by social workers who studied the psychological impact of federal prosecution on defendants from privileged backgrounds. His case had influenced policy discussions about appropriate sentencing for young adults whose criminal behavior was influenced by family pressure and systematic corruption. The Manning family's financial ruin had been complete, their assets liquidated to pay restitution to fraud victims and legal fees that had consumed their wealth without preventing conviction. Cole's parents had served their sentences in minimum security facilities, but their social standing had been permanently destroyed by the federal convictions. Derek Stone's transformation from privileged criminal to reformed advocate continued to inspire discussion about redemption and rehabilitation within the federal criminal justice system. His paralegal work with defense attorneys had provided valuable insights into how defendants' backgrounds influence their participation in corruption networks. Derek's testimony in subsequent cases had helped prosecutors understand the psychological dynamics that allowed corruption networks to recruit and maintain participant loyalty. His insights had proven particularly valuable in developing intervention programs that helped students recognize and resist systematic pressure to participate in academic fraud. Victoria's commendations from grateful parents had been joined by recognition from international education organizations that had adopted American anti-corruption technologies and methods. The global impact of Operation Clean Slate continued to expand as other countries discovered similar corruption networks operating within their own educational institutions. The automated monitoring systems had been licensed to educational ministries in 47 countries, extending American expertise in fraud detection to institutions worldwide. Victoria had traveled extensively to provide training and consultation, her military background and federal experience providing credibility with international law enforcement agencies. The artificial intelligence algorithms had continued to evolve, now incorporating machine learning capabilities that allowed them to identify increasingly subtle patterns of manipulation. The technology had proven so effective that several major universities had volunteered to serve as beta test sites for the next generation of fraud detection systems. Victoria's marriage to Agent Rodriguez had been strengthened by their shared commitment to protecting educational integrity, their professional partnership extending naturally into personal compatibility. Their Virginia home had become a gathering place for other federal investigators working on education-related cases. The couple's decision to delay having children had been influenced by the demanding travel schedules required for complex, multi-jurisdictional investigations, but they had begun discussing adoption seriously as their careers stabilized. They were particularly interested in providing homes for older children whose educational opportunities had been affected by the corruption networks they investigated. Victoria's parents had become unexpected celebrities in their retirement community, her father's military background and her mother's teaching experience providing them with unique perspectives on their daughter's federal law enforcement career. They had been invited to speak at several conferences about supporting family members who chose careers in federal service. The 5 words that had frozen Ethan Blackwood had been incorporated into federal law enforcement training programs as an example of how proper identification and authority assertion could de-escalate potentially dangerous confrontations. Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're done. Had become part of the standard curriculum for agents specializing in white-collar crime investigation. Victoria's office walls had expanded to accommodate additional commendations and recognition from organizations representing students who had benefited from federal intervention in corruption cases. Each certificate represented families whose children had been protected from systematic exploitation by trusted educational institutions. The Westbridge preparatory investigation was revealing connections to corruption networks in several other states, suggesting that the cryptocurrency-based fraud operation was even more extensive than initially suspected. Victoria's team was coordinating with federal prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions to ensure that all participants faced appropriate charges regardless of their geographic locations. The investigation had uncovered evidence of international money laundering that extended far beyond educational fraud, revealing connections to offshore banking schemes that had attracted attention from federal agencies responsible for financial crimes and national security. Victoria found herself working with investigators whose expertise in international finance complemented her educational fraud specialization. The morning sun had given way to afternoon shadows as Victoria prepared to leave her office for another day of depositions and witness interviews in the Westbridge case. The work continued to evolve and expand, requiring constant adaptation to new criminal methods and technologies. The torn dress from room 204 at Millfield Academy remained in the Smithsonian's collection, but its symbolic value had grown beyond any single exhibit. School groups from across the nation visited the display, learning about the importance of individual courage in protecting institutional integrity and the power of federal law enforcement to ensure accountability regardless of wealth or social position. The story that had begun with privilege confronting courage would continue wherever corruption threatened educational integrity, with federal agents trained in Victoria's methods standing ready to ensure that justice remained available to all students regardless of their families, resources, or social connections. Victoria gathered her case files and prepared for another evening of preparation for the complex legal proceedings that would determine the fate of the latest generation of educational criminals. The work would never be finished, but each successful prosecution made the next one more likely to succeed. The investigation that had started with fabric tearing in a high school classroom had evolved into permanent federal infrastructure that would protect American education for as long as vigilant citizens remained willing to report corruption and federal agents remained committed to pursuing justice wherever evidence led them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new criminals, and new opportunities to demonstrate that systematic corruption could not withstand systematic investigation conducted by professionals committed to protecting those who could not protect themselves. Victoria Kane would continue keeping her promise to defend educational integrity, one case at a time, for as long as such defense remained necessary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.